My name is Marcus Thompson. I'm 38 years old now, living in Detroit, Michigan. But my story begins in the shadows of violence and despair, where I spent 15 years, trapped in a cycle of hatred that nearly destroyed my soul. I grew up in the roughest part of the city's east side, where gunshots were lullabies, and survival was the only religion. My father was shot dead when I was just 6 years old, leaving my mother to raise 4 children on her own. She worked 3 jobs just to keep food on the table, but her absence left a void that the streets were eager to fill. By 12, I was already angry at a world that seemed unfair, carrying a rage inside me that grew with each passing day. The local gang became my family. They offered what I thought was love, protection, and brotherhood, but they were selling me lies. My first act of violence came at the age of 14, when I beat a kid unconscious for wearing the wrong colors. The rush of power I felt was like a drug in my veins, pushing me deeper into darkness. With each passing day, my mother tried to save me with prayers and tears, but I was too far gone, too consumed by hatred. The gang became everything: my identity, my purpose, my reason for breathing, in a world that seemed cold. By 16, I had my first gun. It felt heavy in my hands, but the weight of it made me feel invincible. I started dealing drugs, running protection rackets, becoming everything my mother prayed I wouldn't be. The money came easy, but with it came enemies. People who wanted what I had, or wanted me dead. I survived 3 attempts on my life before 20, each time growing colder, more determined to strike back. Revenge became my mission, an eye for an eye, until everyone around me was as blind as I was. I remember the night that should have ended it all, when rival gang members cornered me in an alley. 15 shots were fired. 3 hit me directly in the chest and stomach, leaving me for dead. I lay there in the rain, watching my blood mix with dirty puddle water, thinking this was the end. But something happened in those moments between life and death that I can't explain. As my vision grew dim and the pain intensified, I heard a voice so clear it cut through everything. "Son, this is not your end." The voice was gentle but firm, filled with authority and infinite love. I tried to speak, but could only cough blood. Yet in my mind I screamed, "Please help me!" That's when I felt it. A warmth spreading through me, different from the blood that soaked my clothes. It was like being embraced by pure light and love, something I had never known in all my years of darkness. I don't remember much after that, until I woke up in the hospital 3 days later, with tubes keeping me alive. The doctors called it a miracle that I had survived at all. But I knew it was more than just medical science. My mother was there, holding my hand and praying, just as she had done for all those years. But this time was different. I could feel the power in her words of faith, touching my broken spirit. During those weeks of recovery, I had time to think about the path I had chosen and where it had led me. The gang members visited, bringing threats of retaliation, but their words seemed hollow now, compared to that voice in the alley. Something had changed inside me. A seed had been planted in soil that was once too hard for anything good to grow. My mother brought her pastor to visit me in the hospital, a man I had always mocked for his messages of peace. But his words were different now. They reached places in my heart that had been locked away behind walls of anger. He spoke of transformation, of second chances, of a love so powerful it could break any chain. I listened, really listened, for the first time in my life, to messages of hope that seemed meant just for me. The pastor shared his own story of gang life and redemption, showing me that change was more than just possible. He had walked my path, felt my pain and anger, but found a way out through faith and surrender. As my body healed, something else was happening, a deeper healing. In my wounded soul, I began to read the Bible my mother had given me, finding stories of violence transformed by divine love. The words jumped off the pages, speaking directly to my heart, showing me a different way to view my life and purpose. I learned about forgiveness, not just receiving it, but extending it to those who hurt me. This was the hardest part, letting go of the hatred that had defined me for so many years. But with each prayer, each scripture read, the walls began to crumble, brick by brick. When I was finally released from the hospital's care, I knew I couldn't go back to my old neighborhood. My mother had arranged for me to stay with my aunt in a different part of the city, away from gang territory. It wasn't easy starting over. Everything I knew was gone. My status, my power, my false sense of security. The withdrawal was brutal, not just from drugs, but from the adrenaline of street life itself. I had nightmares every night, reliving the shooting, hearing the gunshots, feeling the bullets tear through me. But each time I woke up, that gentle voice remained, reminding me that I was saved for a greater purpose. Pastor Johnson visited regularly, teaching me about faith, showing me how to pray when words seemed inadequate. He introduced me to others who had left the gang life, forming a support group of broken men seeking healing. We met in the church basement, sharing our stories, our struggles and victories. In this new way of living, some days were harder than others. When old friends would call, offering easy money and familiar temptations. But something was different now. I could see through the lies, recognize the poison hidden in their promises. My mother's prayers were finally being answered. As she watched her son transform day by day, I started attending church, not just on Sundays, but whenever the doors were open, hungry for more of God's presence. The worship touched something deep within my spirit, healing wounds I didn't know I still carried. I learned to lift my hands in praise instead of violence, to open my mouth in prayer rather than threats. The transformation wasn't instant. It came in small moments, daily choices to walk away from my former life. I had to learn new skills, how to work an honest job, how to handle conflict without reaching for a weapon. Pastor Johnson helped me enroll in a GED program, showing me that education could open new doors. Studying was challenging after years on the streets, but I was determined to change my story. My first job was cleaning at the very church that had become my refuge. It was humble work, but every dollar earned felt different from before. Clean money, honest work, building a new foundation. The other church members didn't judge my past. They embraced me fully, showing Christ's love in action. I found myself crying often as God's love broke through. Years of hardened defenses, built for survival. The tears were healing, washing away the pain of a childhood lost to violence and fear. 6 months into my new life, I faced my biggest test when I ran into members of the rival gang. They recognized me instantly, hands reaching for weapons, expecting the old Marcus to emerge and fight. But something miraculous happened as I stood there unarmed, feeling God's presence surrounding me like a shield. I looked them in the eyes and said words I never thought would come from my mouth. "I forgive you for shooting me." They stood there stunned, weapons half drawn, confusion replacing hatred. In their hardened faces, I continued speaking, sharing my testimony. Right there on the street, where I almost died. Some laughed and walked away, but one stayed behind, tears streaming down his face, asking how to find peace. That encounter became the first of many, where my past pain became a bridge to healing. God was using my story to reach others trapped in the same cycle of violence I had known so well. I began sharing my testimony in juvenile detention centers, speaking to young men heading down the path I knew. Their eyes would light up, seeing someone who understood their language, their pain, their desperate need for love. I told them about the voice in that rain-soaked alley, how God's love had found me when I was bleeding out. Some would mock and sneer, just as I once did, but others would listen, hope flickering in their eyes. Pastor Johnson trained me to become a youth minister, teaching me how to channel my street knowledge for God. I learned to use my experience not as a badge of shame, but as a testimony to God's transforming power. The same intensity that once fueled my violence now drove me to reach others with God's love. My ministry began to grow beyond what I imagined as word spread about. The former gang leader, who now preached peace and transformation through Jesus Christ. Young people came from everywhere, seeking answers, hoping to find the same freedom I had discovered. In God's amazing grace, I established a program called Streets to Salvation, combining practical help with spiritual guidance. We offer job training, counseling services, and most importantly, a safe place to belong. The same streets where I once dealt drugs and violence became my mission field, where I now dealt hope. My old gang members watched from a distance, some mocking, others curious about my transformation. But slowly, one by one, they began to come, first just to talk, then to seek help. One night, my former leader, the man who had taught me to be ruthless and cold, showed up at my door. He was tired, he said, of living in darkness, of watching young men die for nothing but colors. We prayed together that night. Two former enemies, now brothers in Christ, united in God's love. The transformation spread like ripples in a pond, touching lives I never thought I could reach before. Mothers would bring their sons, begging for help to save them from the streets. That almost claimed my life. I remembered my own mother's tears, her countless prayers, now answered and multiplied. Through my ministry, we opened a community center in the heart of gang territory, a neutral ground where rivals could meet and find peace. The building wasn't much, an old warehouse converted, but it became holy ground, where miracles happened daily. We offered basketball games, where rival gang members played on mixed teams, learning to see past colors. Computer classes taught by reformed gang members, showing a path to success beyond the streets. GED preparation courses, where former enemies sat side by side, pursuing education. But most importantly, we offered love, unconditional and pure, just as Christ loved us. The police were skeptical, at first watching closely, as known gang members entered our doors. But over time, they saw the change in the neighborhood, the decrease in violence, the increase in hope. Local churches partnered with us, providing resources and support. As they saw God's hand moving in our work, business owners who once feared gang violence began hiring our graduates, giving second chances. The transformation wasn't just in individual lives, but in the whole community. As hope replaced fear, I met Sarah during this time, a social worker who came to volunteer at our center, sharing our vision. She had her own story of redemption and grace, and together we found God's purpose for our lives. We married 2 years later, combining our ministries to reach even more people with God's transforming love. Our wedding was a testimony, as former gang members from rival territories celebrated together. Today, our center serves hundreds of young people, offering them alternatives to gang life and violence. We've seen hardened criminals become youth pastors, drug dealers become counselors, violence turned to peace. My mother often visits, tears of joy in her eyes, as she watches God use her former prodigal son. She leads prayer meetings now for other mothers whose children are lost to the streets we once knew. My scars remain, 3 bullet wounds that tell of a past redeemed by God's amazing grace. But they no longer bring shame. Instead, they're my testimony of how far God's love can reach into darkness. Yendi.